I chose the Kansas State Masters of Agribusiness program for two reasons. The first is program flexibility. I wanted to be able to go to school while maintaining a full-time job. The second is that it's agriculturally focused. I intend on staying in the agriculture industry long-term, and this program complements that with a faculty and staff that know and understand my long-term objectives.
Thank you for joining us today for the Meet the Farm Hands video segment. I'm your host, Hannah Pagel, and today we are with James Glueck, Vice President of Michael Torrey Associates. James, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks for the invitation. Kind of humbling. I've spent a lot of my career working with folks who are in interviews and visiting with yourself and others on the Agri-Pulse team and other reporters, and so it's a little bit different to be sitting in the seat and have the mic clipped to my jacket. So thanks for the invitation.
Well, we are happy to have you. So to start off the interview, let's just go back to the very beginning. Why don't you tell us where you're from and kind of just explain how you made your way out to the Beltway?
Yeah, absolutely. Originally from Texas, but my twin sister and I were born in Georgia, something a lot of folks don't know. My dad was doing some peanut research when early in his career, and so we lived in South Georgia for 3 years and was born there. But Texas is home. Went to high school in West Texas. Parents lived near Houston in a little town, Cat Spring, in Colorado County. And so I grew up around agriculture in Texas, went to Texas A&M, and then after graduation ended up moving to Washington.
Okay, and kind of explain some of the internships that you had before you started your career here.
Absolutely. So a lot of folks come to Washington the first time as an 8th grade student, as an 8th grade trip or a junior high trip or a high school trip. My sister and I didn't join our class on that outing. I can't remember if it was something 4-H related or what the conflict was, but we didn't do that. So both of us, our freshman year of college, really wanted to come to Washington. So I interned that first summer after my freshman year with the National 4-H Center up in Chevy Chase. Worked in their marketing department, was a big active 4-H'er in Texas and involved in FFA as well, and so it got me to Washington for the first time. Coincidentally, my twin sister interned for George Washington's farm as a historical interpreter, so she was out dressed in period garb, telling folks about farming and agriculture that summer, hot and humid, and I was sitting in an office, doing marketing reports and working with folks in different states from a 4-H perspective.
Okay. And tell me about your time in Argentina.
Yeah, absolutely. So the second summer, I realized that I didn't get to really experience government, and so I came back to Washington, interned for my hometown congressman, a guy named Larry Combest, and spent half the summer there. And then my third summer as an intern, worked in South America and Argentina for the State Department in the economic office. And so it gave me a chance to better understand public service from that perspective, and also live abroad. I'd studied Spanish in school, majored in agricultural development, and so it was a chance to really explore kind of firsthand what the government does in our partnerships in embassies around the world. Okay.
And so after you graduated from college, you began working at USDA underneath the Bush administration. Can you kind of just talk about, what was it like working for 3 different agriculture secretaries?
Yeah, absolutely. I came out here like a lot of folks didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't have a job. I'd interned, but ended up being from Texas, had an opportunity to work in the Bush administration. There's a quick break between graduation of undergrad and moving to Washington, and I helped some friends of the family plant winter wheat and spent some time in a lot of time in a tractor, and decided, that's not what I went to school for, although there are plenty of days in 19 years in Washington that I look back and you've kind of plowed a field and you can see what you've done. So kind of a different perspective. But did have the chance in those 6 years at USDA to work and observe the leadership of 3 ag secretaries, Ann Veneman from California, Mike Johans from Nebraska, and then Ed Schaefer from North Dakota. And so they brought their own regional perspectives, kind of previous careers in state government in all 3 cases actually, and just kind of interesting to me to observe as a young person, just sort of how ag in different states, in kind of national problems. And, Ann Veneman, while she was the ag secretary, we had the mad cow, the cow that stole Christmas. I was there that day, so crisis, watching, folks lead through some really trying and challenging situations. Homeland security issues were very high on the to-do list. The trade agenda, very, very important. You spent a lot of time in kind of multinational conversations. Mike Johans, the 2008 Farm Bill, he was the impetus for listening sessions all over the country, sit and listen to growers, stakeholders, and what works, what needs to be improved, and then part of a team at USDA that put together recommendations, put together legislative language, send it up to Congress, and Congress, observed what was sent to them and did what they do. So.
Mm-hmm. And so when you were a senior advisor for the Foreign Agriculture Service, can you kind of just explain like what your biggest takeaway was working in that position?
Yeah, absolutely. The last role I had at USDA was working with the Undersecretary at the time of the Farm and Foreign Agriculture area, Mark Keenum from Mississippi. And that role at the time handled domestic farm programs, so crop insurance, Farm Service Agency, as well as the trade side, the Foreign Ag Service. And so he had a heavy job with trade negotiations, Doha conversations, as well as the 2008 Farm Bill that was being discussed at the time. And so watching someone really seek to listen to growers, seek to listen to men and women in public service with solutions, and try to find common ground, knowing that when someone brings a solution to you, making sure that it works well for other players, and really trying to understand the problem and where solutions might lie. And so that's, my role was mostly just to help manage the schedule, make sure that the papers were ready, did some travel, saw a lot of the world that, as a kid growing up in Texas never imagined. So some pretty neat and opportunities to learn a lot from those conversations.
All right. So from USDA, you then went to the private sector and worked for Bunge, but then you came to Capitol Hill and got back into public service. So I'm curious, what made you want to come back?
I did. But career is sort of a unique one, and that's, goes to the private sector, it comes back to public service. But that's something I think just really goes back to my roots, and that's, in college, went to Texas A&M. Service is a big part of that curriculum, the other education. Had a chance to work with former President Bush 41, his entire career, devoted to 1,000 Points of Light, public service. So just a lot of men and women that have, been very generous with their time with me, that instilled in me the importance of public service. I spent 2 years working for a grain company, global grain company. Really enjoyed that work. Learned a ton about sort of that business and sort of the how things move and sort of fascinating challenges. But that call to service is something that you can't really put a price tag on. So former Ag Secretary Mike Johans, then Senator Johans, was looking for someone to work on ag issues for what he said was 1 year during what would have been the 2011-2012 Farm Bill. And so I said, why not? I was young enough and eager enough to do something different, that go to Capitol Hill, go to the Senate for 1 year to work on a farm bill.
Okay, and speaking of farm bills, you had your fair share in working on 2018, 2014. Can you kind of talk about what it was like to work as a staffer and to make those negotiations on the farm bill?
Yeah. I think, you mentioned farm bills, you mentioned 2018, 2014, was at USDA for the 2018 process and started at USDA during the 2002 implementation process. So kind of have some perspectives that are not necessarily lined up the way they usually are, but the last, two bills on the Hill. The 2014 process is one that, I ended up working on the committee after 2 years with Senator Johans for Thad Cochran from Mississippi. So had a unique regional perspective working for a Midwestern member, and then working on the committee with a ranking member who is from a southern state. And so really had appreciation for a policy that works for folks no matter where you grow, what you grow, no matter what you grow. And that folks have challenges. And so really listening first to growers, listening first to those stakeholders, and trying to find a path forward instead of kind of going all in on one side of the ledger or the other, but really trying to find policy that functions for folks throughout the industry.
Mm-hmm. Between all of the farm bills that you worked on, was there one that was more challenging than the other?
The 2014 Farm Bill took several iterations. It took several Congresses. It took players changed throughout that process, and so that's challenging whenever you build up trust and you build up teams and expertise. And some of those shifts happen. Those conversations change, and so you've got players around the table that have strong views that are locked in, but maybe some new players, and being at one point a new player at a table was a challenge to try to understand the history and how to navigate the path forward. But for me, the most challenging would probably be the 2018 Farm Bill, and more than anything, just the role I played. From when you're a staffer and your boss changes or you're in a different seat, you have a different responsibility. And in 2018, working with Senator Roberts, Chairman Pat Roberts, his responsibility was to get a bill through the Senate, working with his partner, now Chair Debbie Stabenow, but also chaired the conference at a time when our country, like today, it's very divided, very challenging to get bipartisan legislation through in a standalone fashion. So we were tasked not just with getting a bill through the Senate, a bill that worked well, but getting that bill through the conference process, working with our counterparts and our colleagues from the House side.
Okay. So besides Farm Bill, which took up a lot of your time as a staffer, but you also worked a lot on the GMO labeling bill. So, what's a lasting memory that you have from working on the GMO labeling debate?
Yeah. Farm bills are something that, staff often work on, every 5 years or so, but legislation like biotech labeling, biotech disclosure, definitely something that had the opportunity to work on. It wasn't something I sought out and really looked to work on, but we had this patchwork of different state kind of initiatives that were really wreaking havoc on growers' ability to produce safe, affordable, and efficiently, and then our delivery system's ability to provide food to consumers. And so I think personally, that bill was just fascinating. Just the ag value chain, the importance of the ag value chain was really real throughout that conversation. It wasn't just farmers, ranchers, growers who cared. It was folks, small town independent grocers. It was, folks that, throughout the country that had very strong views, consumers, very, very strong views on this policy. And so, very scientific and technical policy as well. And so, food is something that every human being, needs and deals with every day, and then talking about the science around it is a challenge. And so I think that's something that I get a much greater appreciation for dealing through that process.
All right.
I might actually go back and revisit if I can. The other thing I'd say is on that bill, it's not very often that as a staffer you work on legislation, you try to get bipartisan support, and that was always our goal there, knowing that it was important. You take it to the Senate floor and then it doesn't get the support it needs and it fails. And so that was something that was also very humbling. You do all this effort listening and trying to find common ground, and then you don't make it across the finish line on the first try. And so we had to sort of recalibrate back up and work again, with the Senator Roberts and Senator Stabenow and others to find solutions. And it's something anyone who was involved in that debate, the members, the staff, I think, getting the time on the Senate floor again for an agriculture bill, it wasn't a farm bill, I think was something that just for me very telling about the legislative process.
Mm-hmm. Kind of a follow-up question on that then, during that process, you tried passing it once, it didn't go through. What was the turning point? Like, what was talked about that made that click of okay, now we finally got it to go through? Yeah,
timing is everything when you're working on legislation. And I think a big part of the shift in renewed focus within several months was the fact that several of these state statutes took effect. Folks were going to have to start labeling. There was sort of this drop dead date in July, and we got to that date, and I think folks really understood the patchwork approach and the challenge, and were willing to make maybe a little bit more of a compromise on sort of a not just a voluntary approach, but a mandatory approach, providing that marketing-based information, kind of that transparency to consumers. And so that timing question, I think, was the key.
Okay. So going to your time then on the Senate Ag Committee, as staff director, you got to work very closely with the chairman. So I'm very curious, is there a story that you can share that kind of best summarizes your experience working for Chairman Roberts?
There's anyone who's ever spent time in a meeting with Senator Roberts, with Chairman Roberts, or in a conversation with him or heard him speak knows that there are plenty of stories about Pat Roberts, and plenty of stories that someone with 40 plus career in elected office can share and gladly shares. He's always had fond appreciation for journalists, and so I think most of my time as I reflect back on the Farm Bill, we were working through the conference process, knowing that to have productive bipartisan, bicameral conversations, wanting to figure out ways to keep your listeners, your subscribers well informed, and others in the media, but also really keep conversations going productively behind closed doors as well. And so I think one thing that a story I'd have is we had several early morning meetings in his hideaway office among the four principals, Chairman Conaway, Chairman Roberts, Ranking Member Stabenow, Ranking Member Peterson, and it never failed. Those were usually early in the morning because their schedules dictated as such, 7:30, and we would talk about, it's an early morning meeting, got to get up, get ready, and then he would always, several times he would call me late the night before and say, it'd be great if we could have some coffee, some donuts, some little things. So he's always thinking about ways to make members and staff comfortable, and with a sense of humor. But I will say, I think he recognized the need to sort of keep some of those conversations private, even though he was oftentimes, I think you and your colleagues can attest, a great source for tidbits and stories and intel on conversations over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the other thing I'd say about Chairman Roberts is, as I hear and think about your question, from a personal aspect, I mean, just a really, really kind and thoughtful human being. A lot of folks don't know that I was fairly sick around the end of the year last year, when we had a lot of conversation happening around COVID assistance and sort of the legislation that was passed in the House and the Senate. And even though I was working remotely and sort of had a fever and wasn't feeling great, Dr. Roberts called me several times to check in on me. And I think that's telling. Many members that I've worked with in the Senate, and particularly the chairman, would take time out of their busy schedule at a very busy period. His final days in the Senate, was on the Senate floor and everything else, would still take time throughout the day to call in, ask about an issue we were working on, trying to find common ground, trying to get together in a package, but also really take the time to ask about my health, how was I feeling, and I think that interest in people is something that I think is very telling.
Mm-hmm. So, throughout your time on Capitol Hill, you worked in various different staffing positions, and now you are a lobbyist. So I'm curious, since you've been on the other end of those emails, those phone calls, those meetings with the lobbyist, does that experience kind of influence how you conduct your business now as like a lobbyist?
I think absolutely. I think perspective is everything. I've seen that in every role that I've been privileged to serve. And so I think, now the work that I do in just a couple of weeks, working on this side of the table, I guess you could say, it is informative to understand, the schedule in the Senate, the schedule on the Hill, some of the other demands that staff might have. They're not just sitting there waiting for someone to call to educate and share thoughts, but trying to think proactively about what the information needs might be and how to best package it for different members, different bosses. So I think definitely those perspectives inform how I think about problem solving and working with folks. The other thing I'd say is, as a staffer and someone who's helped manage and build out teams, having different perspectives on that team really, really valuable, and something that I looked at and thought about, and looking at next steps after the Senate. But I think back to the biotech labeling debate, the team that I was working on, we had someone who had worked for a food company, someone who had worked for a commodity organization, someone who had worked for someone in the grain handling industry, and so those different perspectives were really valuable in solving that problem. And in the role now with the Torrey team, definitely value the fact that the team I'm on has perspectives, works with folks from different parts of the industry.
Mm-hmm. So across the span of your 20-year career in agriculture policy, a lot of changes have been made during that time. Has there been one that has kind of stuck out the most, or the biggest change that you've seen? Can you kind of talk about that?
Yeah, no, when you say 20-year career, it sort of still surprises me. I feel like I'm the young guy at the table, like I was 20 years ago at USDA. But you're right, it is 20 years, and I'm not the young guy at the table. But there are a lot of other bright and much brighter folks that sit around those tables. But no, I think the one thing that strikes me was right around 2007, 2010, the commodity price increases, where we had this really international conversation around kind of the price of food, the price of feed, the price of fuel, and how all of a sudden it's almost like overnight the interest in agriculture changed. Prior to that, it was always a struggle to get a mention of agriculture in the State of the Union. I distinctly remember when President Bush, George W. Bush, mentioned switchgrass and how exciting that was. Something that we were working on at USDA had made it into the State of the Union. But I'd say in the last probably 10 years, now all of a sudden food is front and center. You have chefs really focused on kind of how our food is made, where it comes from. We have consumers more interested now than ever before in kind of how food is grown, how it's raised. Folks also still very interested in that value proposition. In American agriculture, we're very successful at efficiency, using science and innovation. And that's something that's not just in the last 10, 15, 20 years, but generations. No matter where you live in this country or in the world, like farmers are innovators. They're folks that tinker and fix a tractor there in the shop, or figure out how do we plant in a way that makes a little more sense. And so I think that's something that hasn't changed, but this consumer interest in agriculture is probably the thing that, at least to me, most exciting. And this innovation looks a lot different today than it did 5, 10, 15 years ago. But the space, that's why I enjoy it, because it's constantly changing, constantly growing. Mm-hmm.
So we've talked a lot about your career in agriculture policy. So let's kind of transition the conversation and get to know you more on a personal level. So I hear you have a green thumb.
I do. I do enjoy plants. I've always enjoyed kind of gardening, kind of tinkering with plants, and so even in our nation's capital, Washington D.C., I've got a garden plot. It means I'm a member of a community garden and spend time early in the morning and the evenings, at different points in the last several years, working on the biotech labeling bill, working on farm bills. I was out there late in the evening with a flashlight at times, weeding, watering. But I do have a garden. At times, coworkers and teammates have benefited from, when there's a lot of tomatoes to share or lots of zucchini to share. But even in a 10 by 10 square here in our nation's capital, I'm able to kind of meet that need. The other thing I'd say is it's kind of fun to kind of work in ag policy, get mired in, frustrations on, what's happening in this issue space or that issue space, farm bill issue, and then be able to kind of get your hands dirty and kind of bring it back at least in a very small way to kind of what this conversation is really about. And that's, growing food for our friends, our families, and folks in our lives. So.
Mm-hmm. What does your garden consist of? I'm always curious what people like to have in their garden.
Yeah.
Is there something that you've never had before that you're like, I'm just going to plant this?
Yeah, no, I always, every year I'm a little bit different. And here, DC it allows for a pretty long growing season. But it's got the staples, cucumbers, tomatoes, greens, salad. So things that, I just like to have on the table, squash, zucchini. But also this year, a new kind of challenge for me was garlic. So I've kind of harvested my own garlic, which is kind of fun. Haven't tried it yet, but just recently harvested garlic. And so every year try new varieties. Carrots. I've tried potatoes, had a lot of success one year, and the last 2 years didn't have any success. And so this year there are no potatoes in my little garden plot. But when you've only got 10 by 10, you have to be very careful in how you use your space and provide as much intensity as possible.
Besides gardening, besides working on agriculture policy, what else can we find you doing outside of work?
Yeah, I'm not someone who loves the big city necessarily, and so a lot of my time outside of work, when you can find time outside of work, is trying to strike that balance. It means getting out to visit friends who live elsewhere, getting outside. So really into hiking. Spend a lot of time in West Virginia. Spend a lot of time running. Kind of fitness is also something that's an interest of mine. A lot of folks don't know I'm certified to teach yoga. At a point in time, I did kind of 2 years of yoga teacher training. So kind of trying to strike that balance between working at a desk, kind of the stress that comes with that, and believe it or not, those yoga skills have been really valuable going into Farm Bill conference meetings. Just kind of relax, calm, remind yourself that there's a lot outside the four walls of kind of Congress, and so getting out to visit friends and family, getting back home, I think that really creates that balance. And it also allows you to kind of reflect on kind of what we do in Washington, the policy conversation, the policy fights. It can kind of become all-consuming, and so finding ways very intentionally to unplug, to me is very powerful. It is very important.
So throughout your career, you've worked with a variety of different people. Who would you say has been a mentor to you in your career?
It's hard to kind of reflect and think on just who one mentor would be. I've been, as you indicate, very, very lucky. Someone who came here for what I thought was maybe 1 year from Texas to have roles and work with people that I would have never imagined. You mentioned 3 ag secretaries, the chance to learn from them from afar, a whole host of undersecretaries at USDA. The other thing I'd say is I learned a lot from my peers. Managing teams in Senate Ag Committee, working in an office, anyone that I've worked around, I kind of look at as a mentor. Something I really do value is just trying to connect with folks as people. It's not necessarily the seat you sit in or kind of the degree you hold or the state you're from or who your boss is, but really trying to figure out, in the ag and food space, it touches all of our lives, and so we all have a pretty clear perspective. So just trying to learn from those peers around me. Anyone that I've sat next to, that I've sat in office with, I kind of look to as a mentor. Mm-hmm. The other thing I'd say on mentorship, when I moved to Washington, I had some advice that was given to me that I reflect on frequently in the last 20 years. And it's from an individual who worked for former President Bush 41, and I'd interned in his office while I was in college. And so, gave me some really good advice. A couple of the things that she indicated was, you don't go to Washington to make friends, which at the time I thought, I'm brand new, I need to meet people, but you're not there to just make decisions in a policy sphere that sort of help folks that are friendships, but you're really there to do a job. And so that to me has always been telling. Treat people with respect, but at the end of the day, you've got a job to do. The other thing is that don't forget that it's a special place, and that's something that I tell folks. I I'm a big runner, and so I run on the Mall, and when I see the Capitol, see the Washington Monument, when you don't kind of get that little bit of a chill, this is a special place, that it's time to maybe pack up and move back home, wherever that might be. So.
That actually kind of sparked a follow-up question, but did you ever take meetings on the go when you were on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, I have been known to do mobile meetings, as I've referred to them, which is going out for a run, early in the morning or at noon with a colleague or someone else, and so the chance to, instead of grabbing a drink or grabbing a coffee, which is very common in this town, I've always often will suggest if someone wants to go for a run, I'm happy to meet on the Mall, and I've done that with folks working other parts of government, folks that working on the same team, and so I say it makes for really good conversation when you're both facing forward. You're maybe challenging each other on the pace. If the topic gets such that it's challenging, maybe I'll speed up if I don't want to talk, and so it's a mobile meeting is something that's always kind of a different solution.
Mm-hmm. So to kind of wrap up the interview, we always like to end the segment on this question, but if you could go back to day one, knowing everything that you know now, what advice would you tell yourself?
If I could go back and talk to myself, 20 years ago, I think the easiest thing I'd say is just don't stress so much. It'll be okay. I think a lot of folks think I'm very calm on the outside and kind of level-headed, but it's like a duck paddling underwater. There's a lot of, did I remember to do this, remember to do that, return the series of phone calls. And especially early on, didn't know where that next job was coming from. My parents are not political at all, and so at USDA, I think I had 4 or 5 different roles in the 6 years there. And my mother would always ask, is this one more secure than the last one? Knowing that it was all based on an election cycle. And that's been kind of a testament, different points in my career. And so letting myself know that it'll all be okay, not to stress so much about, kind of what happens 2 years from now, 4 years from now, but just keep doing a good job and kind of work with the people around you, focusing on those relationships and kind of that I think would give myself some comfort.
Mm-hmm. Well, James, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me again. Very humbling to be invited to kind of join and visit with you. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very used to kind of staying in the corner when someone else is sitting in the chair with a mic clipped to their chest. So this has been really fun and enjoyed it. So thanks.